Okay, so the next step for a property manager or an asset manager who's managing a portfolio of properties is to consider their exit strategy. And we're going to assume an exit strategy of selling the property for right now. So let's get started. If we're property manager, we're assuming we're going to buy a property, manage it for N years, and then sell it. We, of course, have to estimate our selling methodology and the price that we're going to get, hopefully, for selling the property. What we're going to do is estimate our before-tax equity proceeds, compute our tax, which will be complicated, and then compute our after-tax proceeds to equity. Okay. We've got an estimated sale price of $5.6 million and change for this property after 5 years. How did they come to that? Well, they just assumed that the sale price would increase by 6% a year for each of the 5 years. In future courses, we don't have time to go into this in this class, but you'll spend a lot of time creating better methods of estimating sales price for properties in the future. So we're just going to defer our discussion on that for right now. Okay, so back to Apex. Again, they're assuming $5.6 million sale price after 5 years. They're assuming that for a broker to make that sale happen, that's going to take 5% of the sales price. So their net sales price is going to be $5.4 million, roughly. All right, so what do they do when they sell this thing? They've got two things that they've got to do. The first is they're going to have to pay off their lender, the unpaid mortgage balance. And again, we're assuming right now there is no penalty for early repayment of the mortgage in this case. So they go ahead and do that. The building gets sold for 5.6. They pay the broker. They have 5.4 left. They pay off their unpaid mortgage balance, and then they have about $4.5 million left. Where did we get this unpaid mortgage balance from? Well, that comes from the mortgage cash flow tables year by year by year. All right, so what's going to come up next? Well, you always have to pay tax when you sell a property unless you have a starker exchange, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So let's start looking at that. There are two types of tax that we're going to have to consider. One is capital gains tax, and that's a tax that you have on anything that you purchase and hold for a while and resell. Anything from a stock or even a bond. If you bought a bond, held it for a while and resold it, the difference between the price you sell for and the price you pay is called the capital gain. If you sell it at a loss, it's called the capital loss. Right now, for wealthy folks who hold on to an investment for more than a year, the capital gains tax is 15%. So we'll work our way down to that. All right, so first let's get the capital gain. All right, the IRS allows you to subtract brokers' commissions from your gross sales price to get what they call net sales price. So you work with that to compute your capital gains tax, and then you subtract your investment basis, and they don't care about how you finance this purchase, right? what was paid for this property was $4.2 million. They don't care that you got a mortgage to help you make that payment. So the capital gain here is $1.14 million. 15% of that is $171,000. There's a little more to say about this. The investment basis in this case is just the purchase price. But what if they decided to improve the property along the way in year 3 and add a story to the building, make it a 3-story building? That would be non-maintenance CapEx. That would be a capital improvement. So they'd have to throw in the cost of that to their investment basis. Okay, so the second tax that we've got to take care of when you sell a property is specific to real estate, and this is called the depreciation recovery tax, which we'll call for DRT for short, depreciation recovery DR for short. Okay. And so the way that this works is you take all the accumulated depreciation that you've declared on your tax returns while you've owned up the property. So you just got to go back to your tax returns for each year, add them all up. Okay, you take that, and the depreciation recovery tax rate is now 25%, so you multiply that by 25%, and then you have to pay tax 25% of the total accumulated depreciation that you've declared on this property, which in this case is $191,000 and change. Okay, so now down here we're just adding up the capital gains tax and the depreciation recovery tax, and so the total tax they're going to have to pay is about $363,000. So let's see what we've got here now. Remember, we want to figure this all out for equity. And at the end of the day, we're going to take all the numbers that we've created and put them into what? Comprehensive after-tax cash flows for equity, and get an NPV for this project and maybe an IRR for the whole project, but certainly an NPV. Okay, so we've got their before tax proceeds to equity here, $4.5 million. That's after paying the broker and after paying the mortgage balance. So we also have to subtract the tax on resale. So the after-tax sale proceeds to equity are going to be $4.2 million approximately. So with that, we could do the simplest thing we could do before we even get to DCF, is we could do a return analysis on this, which of course has no time value. Okay, so what we're going to do is just take what we got out of the project minus what we put into the project divided by what we put into the project, and that's going to give us our total return. So first thing we do is get the gain, okay? And what's the gain going to include? It's going to include the net sale proceeds, but it's also going to include what we've got in this line here is the total operating cash flows to equity, right? After tax cash flows to equity for 5 years of operating. I've just totaled them up here, and that's where that number comes from, okay? And then we subtract the total amount that we put into buying this property, not the total cost of the property, but what we put in to this property, and we get our gain, which is about $1.9 million, and $1.9 million over $3.4 million is about 56%. So we got a return of 56% over 5 years, which is not bad, right? A little bit more than 10% a year. Okay, now what we'd like to do is, of course, do better than just return, because time value is very important, especially when you're holding a property for 3, 4, 5, 15, 20 years, right? So the most important method for equity, for sponsors of a project, is NPV, okay? And remember, NPV for a project is just the sum of the individually present valued cash flows for one player at a time for this project. And we have, here's the rigorous formula for NPV. It includes all the cash flows of the project for this player, including any cash flows at t = 0. And we're going to need to discount all these cash flows back, PV them all, by the opportunity cost of capital for this player. And as usual, finding opportunity cost of capital can be a little bit tricky. But in this case, we can actually give it a reasonable shot. Let's use the opportunity cost of capital model, okay? And we could look at, happily, there are two companies that specialize in managing multifamily properties for students that are publicly traded, American Campus Communities or Campus Crest Communities. And we could look at their individual returns and get our opportunity cost of capital for these guys. Second method we could use is the IRR method. And in this case, we would say we invest if the IRR is greater than the opportunity cost of capital. Of course, with NPV, jumping back a page, we're going to invest if the NPV is greater than 0. Okay. And so let's go ahead and find the opportunity cost of capital for this project, for Apex. First of all, what's the mission of CMO, right? Commercial Mostly Mercer Operators. Something like this. We invest in medium-term, 5-year equity investments in multifamily properties rented primarily to students. And so what we would do in this case is search for a multifamily investor. We're just starting out, who has a history and from which we can get an opportunity cost of capital. So best one I could find is American Campus Communities. It's a REIT that owns and manages high-quality student housing communities. It was formed in 1993, and happily it's publicly traded, so we can see some of its performance data. So what I've got here is 10 years of after-tax returns for American Community Properties if you own their stock, and that would make you an equity investor, okay? And I just simply took the average, which is 7%. And the one thing I want to point out here is, as I've said before, the further we go into finance, the worse our models get, right? With our opportunity cost of capital here, we're assuming we're going to get 7% a year. And you can see that for these guys, they get sometimes 6.5, sometimes 6, sometimes even negative, sometimes much bigger than that. So to take this average is probably not a great idea, right? But it's the best we can do, so we do it anyway. So now we have a good opportunity cost of capital for this, and we'll go ahead and use the NPV method on this. So what I've gotten now for CMO is I have their comprehensive after-tax cash flows. So at t = 0, they put in $3.4 million to buy the property. The mortgage lender put in the rest. Their after-tax cash flows from operations from years 1 to 4 are here, and then here I've got their net after-tax cash flow from sale of the property plus their operating after-tax cash flow from operating the property in the 5th year. And now all I do with the NPV method is I discount individually each one of those stinking cash flows back to t equals 0 so I can add them up. So I have apples to apples, and I discount them back at the opportunity cost of capital, and I get $480,000. So that tells us the NPV is greater than 0. Looks like a good project. Now, again, for equity for sponsors, because sponsors may have in here a negative cash flow. If they have a big CapEx that they've got to put on the property, either because of act of God or they want to expand or something like that, in which case getting the right IRR is not guaranteed, as we know. But nonetheless, these cash flows, if they work out this way, are of the form where we know IRR works, just one negative, all the rest positive. And the negative one is either at 0 or the final cash flow. So we go ahead and compute our IRR for these cash flows. And what's the IRR? It's the discount rate that makes the NPV equal to 0. So we go ahead and do that using GoalSeek, and we get an IRR of 10.2%. So IRR and NPV, when the IRR problem is well conditioned, should always give us the same answer. In this case, it does. We have a positive NPV. We have an IRR that's greater than our cost of capital. So yahoo! So they're both saying we should go ahead with this project. Okay. And we can say a little bit more about NPV. There are a couple of interpretations of the NPV. The first thing we can say, using the increased wealth concept, is that by making this investment, we've just made the firm richer than by about $480,000. And richer is measured against doing something like buying shares of ACC, not against doing nothing. In other words, richer is measured against making an opportunity cost of capital investment instead, not doing nothing. Okay. And the second thing that we can say using the equivalence concept is investing in Apex today is completely equivalent to receiving $480,000. And you can convince yourself of this by saying, what if we invest this in the Apex project, and comparing this to receiving $380,000 and investing this is not thousand, this is million, 3.4 million, getting 480,000, adding that to 3.4 million at 7% for 5 years, the money grows to the same amount in 5 years. The one caveat with this is that whenever we do something like this, and always when we're doing this type of problem, we always assume that companies like CMO have a diversified portfolio of properties that they're managing, okay? And that's very important. Central tenet in finance is that smart investors always invest in a diversified portfolio in their investment milieu. Okay, and I think with that, that wraps it up for managing properties.